Good day. It's the Sunday after Easter, and we are now a month into our time of social distancing with the pandemic. What I'd like to do today is sort of set the scene that this is the day that Jesus would have resurrected from the dead. And about noon, a couple of his disciples are going to be making a little journey. And I want to touch on that this morning. It comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verses 13 to 35. And I am reading from the New American Standard Bible today. And behold, two of them were going that very day to a village named Emmaus, which was about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about all these things which had taken place. And while they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself approached and began traveling with them. But their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are these words that you are exchanging with one another as you are walking?" And they stood still, looking sad. One of them, named Cleophas, answered and said to him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem and unaware of the things which have happened here in these days?" And he said to them, "What things?" And they said to him, "The things about Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word in the sight of God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to the sentence of death and crucified him. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, beside all this, it is the third day since these things happened. But also some women among us amazed us. When they were at this tomb early this morning and did not find his body, they came saying that they had also seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of those who are with us went to the tomb and found it exactly as the women also had said, but him they did not see." And he said to them, "O foolish men and slow of heart to believe in all the prophecies have spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and with all the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. And they approached the village where they were going, and he acted as though he were going further. But they urged him, saying, "Stay with us, for it is getting toward evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he had reclined at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed it, and breaking it, he began giving it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to one another, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was speaking to us on the road, while he was explaining the scriptures to us?" And they got up that very hour, and returned to Jerusalem, and found gathered together the 11, and those who were with them, saying, "The Lord has really risen, and has appeared to Simon." They began to relate their experiences on the road, and how he was recognized by them in the breaking of the bread. I think there's a reality that we need to recognize, that the followers of Jesus never really anticipated that he would rise from the dead. He had spoken to them concerning his intention to return, but most of the disciples never fully grasped what he was telling them. To them, the Master was speaking cryptically, perhaps in some mysterious riddles. They never totally got a handle on his explanation of the Old Testament scriptures, even though the way that Jesus taught gave greater insight than any teachings of the rabbis of the synagogue. Certainly, the only ones who truly appreciated his ability to elucidate the scriptures would likely have been the synagogue teachers and the temple priests and scribes, who definitely were not going to admit that openly, Nicodemus being an exception, but even he did so secretly. When Jesus taught openly from the side of a hill or from the stern of a fishing boat, he did so in parables, taking the scriptures and boiling them down into simpler allegories that the less educated could wrap their minds around. Yet time and again his disciples would approach him off to the side and ask him to explain in even simpler terms the simple truths he had already just divulged. Now, if those who followed Jesus, who knew his ins and outs, his ups and downs, who struggled with his words, shedding light on the past and the predicament of the present, then they surely were incapable of deciphering the deepest meaning of what Jesus meant when he was speaking of future events, especially those things of his dying and resurrection. No, the disciples were not expecting Jesus to rise. On the other hand, the high priests and the Pharisees were fearful that he would. In this respect, they may have been more believers than they would have ever dared admit. They had asked Pilate for a security detail of Roman soldiers to keep surveillance at the burial site. It was sort of like a first century homeland security. They had asked Pilate to place a safety seal, sort of like they put on medications or foods to let you know what's inside has not been tampered with. They used the excuse that this was to prevent the disciples from stealing the body and then making false claims that Jesus was risen. The thing is, the priests and the Pharisees knew the nature of the disciples. They knew that more often than not, they just did not get Jesus' teachings or parables. And the disciples had displayed their bravery when they ran off into the night at Gethsemane in order to spare themselves. I think that what really bothered the priests and Pharisees was that they actually might have thought that Jesus could do what he said he would do. And if Jesus was going to walk out of that tomb, the first thing that he would find would be a first line of defense, fearsome Roman soldiers capable of fiercely fighting to kill Jesus again if need be. We find evidence of this in the activities immediately following the burial of Christ. On that first Easter morning, we see no indication that anyone was expecting to meet up with the risen Christ. After all, it was the third day that Jesus had mentioned, but that seemed to escape them, being the farthest thing on their mind, especially in light of such a brutal death that Jesus was subjected to. We find people bringing embalming spices, dressed in mourning clothes, coming to administer their last affections on someone who had meant so much to all of them. When they find the empty tomb, their thoughts are not filled with the hope of resurrection or the fulfillment of what Christ had promised. Instead, their minds went to the worst case scenario. Someone has stolen his body. You see the level of mistrust that is going on here? The priests and Pharisees had expressed fear that Jesus' disciples might take his body, and Jesus' disciples were fearful that the priests and Pharisees would have had the Roman soldiers remove his body and hide it somewhere else. In the minds of the disciples, it is just another in a long list of injustices that have come their way, perhaps no more than a cruel joke. That morning they were not filled with belief. To the contrary, they were filled with disbelief. When they expressed their findings that morning, their report is received with skepticism, and they find that they must defend what they're saying. People are getting up and going to the tomb to see for themselves, doubting the words of their fellow followers, thinking surely they must be mistaken. They're not going to the tomb to prove each other right. They're going to prove each other wrong. They could not believe. They were filled with doubt. They were not joyful. They were troubled. They were suspicious of each other and their stories. This passage finds two of the disciples on their way to Emmaus. They're not talking about possibilities and promises. They are recapping the recent tragedy and trying to make sense out of everything that has happened. They're trying to figure out, where do we go from here? As they're walking along, they are joined by a new traveling companion who they seem not to recognize, nor does it seem too important to recognize who it is. Luke lets the reader in on the fact that their new companion is none other than Jesus, raised from the dead. The two disciples seem shocked at this newcomer's ignorance regarding the death of Jesus of Nazareth. They recollect the acts and teachings of Jesus. They blame the chief priests and national rulers for conspiring to kill him. They display disappointment in trusting that Jesus was the Messiah who would liberate Israel. But they admit to being wrong there, because he's been dead for 3 days now. They talk about news from others concerning his resurrection with skepticism. They know all sorts of things about Jesus except the reality who's standing there with them, carrying on a casual conversation. Primarily, what they seem content and maybe even consumed is to dwell upon the reality of their doubts. Belief and faith seem nowhere in this conversation. Doubt is the adversary of faith, and it is effective in what it does because it can cloud reality. Finally, Jesus breaks into the conversation, having had enough of their negativity. The first thing he does is to challenge them on their faith. In some rather harsh language, Jesus refers to them as fools, immature in matters of belief, and reluctant to accept the prophecy of the prophets as being genuine. He calls into question their attitude, inquiring into why this Jesus that they've been talking about should be exempt from what they have described to bring about God's will in the matter of his people. Jesus then embarks into a refresher course of the Old Testament scriptures pertaining to the one who must be the Savior of the nation. He captures their attention in such a way that they beg him to come into their lodging and spend time revealing more of his knowledge about the scriptures and their application toward the Messiah. Jesus enters into their dwelling with them, and they share a meal together. In the course of dining, Jesus offers a blessing upon the bread, breaks it, and distributes it to them. It is at this point that, here in the presence of these two disciples, it sinks into their consciousness, and then Jesus vanishes in their midst. We might marvel in our own minds how dense these disciples seem to have been. Surely this event was not so obscure that they failed to be able to figure it out for themselves. Then we shouldn't be so hard on these two when our own lives were not a lot better. How often have we also become so preoccupied with our problems, our thoughts, and our predicaments that we have forgotten the promises and teachings of Jesus? We obsess with our circumstances, and in our obsessing, we often fail to recognize who also is walking with us on our journeys. Just like these two disciples, the extraordinary events in life that take on enormous magnitude that can dwarf everything else going around us, we lose sight of the fact that we are not alone. For that reason, just like for the disciples, we fail to find Jesus in the big things in life. Do you realize when they finally recognized that Jesus was with them, it was in the simple breaking of bread? Something so simple. You know, Satan tried to get Jesus to do something spectacular so the world would take notice. The Pharisees told Jesus if he would give them some sort of a wondrous sign that they would believe. On Good Friday, Herod tried to coax Jesus to perform a miracle to entertain them. But as Jesus implied, one parlor trick would never be enough, because there would always be that expectation for just one more encore so they could be sure. And this is how we try to make it too complex. It gets so complicated, it obscures what's already there. It's in the simple things. When Elijah was in the cave, there were all sorts of natural phenomena going on outside. And Elijah found that God was not to be found in all of this commotion. For Elijah, God was found in that still small voice, in the simple things in life. Maybe one of the reasons we have so much trouble recognizing God in our lives today is that our lives have gotten so noisy and complex that we have denied ourselves simplicity. With all the noise of our lives, it becomes impossible to notice that there's a still small voice speaking to us. With all the rushing in our lives, we fail to take the time to notice the subtle nuances like how bread is broken. In fact, we often forget to break bread altogether. Like it or not, simplicity has been thrust upon us by the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of people would argue that life has become more complicated. Some people are skeptical. Some are furious. How dare we have to socially distance ourselves and stay in? Because now we have to be more conscious and intentional of what we're doing. The reality is that the coronavirus has pushed our pause button to allow us to be more deliberate in what we are doing. We have gone from having too much to do to now not being able to do most of the things that we did daily. It may be that humanity is being rebooted. Was not the resurrection a reboot of the world? The triumph of the Easter story is that despite all the turmoil that we have chosen to immerse ourselves in, if we will take the time to listen and watch for God, He will not leave us disappointed. In the process of taking the time to take note in this matter, we might actually find that in our preoccupation with ourselves, our troubles, and our circumstances, just when we thought we were our most alone, talking to ourselves, bathing in our misery, Jesus was with us all along. It just didn't register. I would pray that the Easter message would continue to register to you and your loved ones. You know, it's really not anything fancy. In fact, it's simple. And I think today we need to focus on simplicity.